What if the moment you die, your consciousness doesn't just slip away into nothingness, but slides sideways into a different version of reality entirely? What if dying doesn't end your story, but rewrites it in ways you never expected? The evidence for this impossible scenario is more compelling than you might think, and it comes from the most unlikely source. People who have crossed the threshold between life and death and returned to tell a very disturbing tale. The operating room was sterile, bright, and filled with the controlled chaos that only emergency surgery can bring. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been a cardiac surgeon for 15 years, but what happened during that routine bypass operation would challenge everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. Her patient, a 45-year-old construction worker named Michael, had suffered a massive heart attack at work. The surgery was progressing normally until his heart stopped completely. For 7 minutes, Michael was clinically dead. His brain showed no activity, his heart had ceased beating, and by every medical definition, he had crossed over to whatever lies beyond life. But 7 minutes later, the medical team successfully resuscitated him. When Michael opened his eyes, he seemed fine, grateful to be alive, talking normally with his family. It wasn't until 3 days later that he approached Dr. Martinez with a question that would haunt her for years. "Doctor," he said, his voice uncertain and troubled, "did something change while I was under? Because nothing feels quite right anymore." Michael couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong, but he insisted that small details about his life had shifted. His favorite cereal brand had a different logo than he remembered. A scar on his hand from childhood seemed to be in a slightly different position. His wife's maiden name, which he had known for 20 years, somehow felt wrong when he said it out loud. These weren't major changes, nothing dramatic or immediately noticeable, but they were consistent and unsettling. Dr. Martinez initially dismissed these concerns as common post-surgical confusion. The brain, she explained, often struggles to process traumatic experiences like cardiac arrest. Memory gaps and slight disorientation are normal. But Michael persisted. He started keeping a journal, documenting every small discrepancy he noticed between his memories and his current reality. The journal entries became increasingly detailed and increasingly disturbing. Michael wrote about the Mandela effect, a phenomenon he had never heard of before his surgery, but now seemed to be experiencing firsthand. He remembered learning in school that Nelson Mandela had died in prison in the 1980s, yet news reports clearly showed he had lived until 2013. He distinctly recalled the children's book series being spelled Berenstain Bears, but every copy he could find spelled it Berenstain Bears. These weren't isolated incidents. Michael discovered online communities filled with people who shared identical false memories about brands, movies, historical events, and geographical features. What made his case unique wasn't the Mandela effects themselves, but their timing. Every single discrepancy he noticed seemed to have emerged after his near-death experience. During his 7 minutes of clinical death, Michael had experienced what researchers call a near-death experience. He described floating above his body, watching the surgical team work to revive him. He could recall conversations the staff had during his resuscitation, details that Dr. Martinez later confirmed were accurate. But Michael also described something else during those 7 minutes, something that traditional near-death experience research rarely documents. He claimed to have seen alternative versions of his life playing out simultaneously. In one version, he had become a teacher instead of a construction worker. In another, he had married his high school sweetheart instead of his current wife. These weren't just fleeting glimpses or dreamlike sequences, but fully realized alternate timelines that felt absolutely real and completely vivid. When the medical team revived him, Michael said he felt a strange sensation, like being pulled back from a great distance. But instead of returning to his original life, he wondered if he had been placed into one of those alternative versions instead. The small discrepancies he noticed weren't memory problems, he insisted, but evidence that he was now living in a reality that was almost, but not quite, his own. Dr. Martinez found herself unable to dismiss Michael's claims entirely. His memories of the surgical procedure were too accurate, his documentation too detailed, and his distress too genuine. She began researching the connection between near-death experiences and the Mandela effect. discovering a growing body of anecdotal evidence suggesting that people who survive clinical death often report reality discrepancies afterward. The implications were staggering. If consciousness could somehow shift between parallel realities during the vulnerable moments of death and resurrection, it would revolutionize our understanding of life, death, and the nature of existence itself. But it would also mean that some people who survive near-death experiences aren't just getting a second chance at life. They're getting a second chance at a completely different life. Michael's case wasn't isolated. Dr. Martinez began asking her other patients about post-surgical reality discrepancies and found similar patterns. Not every patient reported these experiences, but among those who had been clinically dead for more than 5 minutes, nearly 40% noticed some form of reality shift afterward. The medical establishment remained skeptical, attributing these reports to trauma-induced confusion or false memory syndrome. But Michael's journal contained over 200 documented discrepancies, cross-referenced with his pre-surgery memories, and corroborated by family members who also noticed the changes.
As Michael adapted to his new reality, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in another dimension, another version of himself was living the life he remembered. The life where the serial logo was different, where his scar was in the right place, where everything made sense according to his memories. 6 months after his surgery, Michael made a startling discovery. He found a photograph from his childhood that showed his scar exactly where he remembered it, not where it currently appeared on his hand. The photo had been taken by his grandmother, who had passed away before his surgery. It was physical evidence that his memories weren't false, but that reality itself had somehow shifted. The question that haunted both Michael and Dr. Martinez was simple yet terrifying. If near-death experiences can transport consciousness between realities, how many other people are living in the wrong version of their lives? How many survivors of clinical death have been quietly placed into alternative timelines, left to notice the small discrepancies and wonder if they're losing their minds? The answer to that question would lead Dr. Martinez down a research path that would challenge everything the medical community believed about consciousness, death, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. Because Michael's case wasn't just unusual. It was part of a pattern that suggested something far more extraordinary and disturbing than anyone had imagined. Are we witnessing proof that death isn't an ending, but a doorway between worlds? And if so, what does that mean for everyone who has ever been brought back from the other side? The breakthrough came when Dr. Martinez discovered she wasn't alone in her observations. Across the country, other physicians were quietly documenting similar cases among their patients who had survived clinical death. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. People who experienced near-death episodes lasting more than 5 minutes frequently reported reality discrepancies afterward, and these discrepancies weren't random hallucinations but followed specific, predictable patterns. Dr. Rachel Kim, a cardiologist in Seattle, had been tracking these anomalies for 3 years. Her research revealed that 47% of patients who survived clinical death exceeding 7 minutes reported some form of Mandela effect afterward. These weren't confused or traumatized individuals struggling with memory loss. These were coherent, intelligent people who could recall surgical details with perfect accuracy, but insisted that fundamental aspects of their reality had quietly changed. The medical data was compelling, but the personal testimonies were even more unsettling. Linda Morrison, a high school teacher who survived a heart attack in 2023, kept meticulous records of her post-NDE observations. She noticed that historical events she had taught for 15 years suddenly had different dates. The geography textbooks in her classroom showed continents positioned differently than she remembered. Most disturbing of all, her students seemed completely unaware of these changes, accepting the new reality as if it had always existed.
During Linda's 7-minute death, she experienced what researchers now classify as a reality junction (NDE). Instead of the typical tunnel of light or life review, she found herself in a space where multiple versions of her life existed simultaneously. She could see herself making different career choices, marrying different people, living in different cities. Each version felt equally real, equally valid, equally her. When the medical team successfully resuscitated Linda, she described feeling like she was being pulled from one of these alternate lives back into another. The sensation wasn't peaceful or comforting, but disorienting and wrong, like being forced into clothes that didn't quite fit. The reality she returned to contained subtle but persistent differences from the one she remembered leaving. Dr. Kim's research team began investigating the neurological mechanisms behind these experiences. Brain scans of patients who reported post-NDE reality shifts showed unusual activity in the posterior superior parietal lobe, the region associated with spatial awareness and self-location. During near-death experiences, this area exhibited patterns never before documented in medical literature. The quantum physics community took notice. Dr. James Wright, a theoretical physicist at MIT, proposed that consciousness might exist as a quantum field capable of existing in multiple states simultaneously. During clinical death, when the brain's normal filtering mechanisms shut down, consciousness could theoretically access parallel quantum realities. The process of resuscitation might not perfectly restore consciousness to its original quantum state, resulting in what he termed quantum drift into adjacent realities. This theory gained unexpected support from an unlikely source: the CIA's declassified research into consciousness and reality. Documents released in 2017 revealed that government researchers in the 1970s had investigated similar phenomena, documenting cases where individuals claimed to have accessed alternate timelines during altered states of consciousness. The research was abandoned not because it was unsuccessful, but because the implications were too disturbing for practical application. The testimonies continued to accumulate. Mark Stevens, a paramedic who survived a cardiac arrest in 2024, returned to work only to find that his 20 years of medical knowledge seemed subtly incorrect. Medications he had administered thousands of times had different names. Emergency procedures he knew by heart had been modified. His colleagues dismissed these concerns as post-traumatic stress, but Mark's documentation revealed systematic changes that affected his entire professional reality. Most compelling were the cases where multiple witnesses corroborated the reality shifts. Jennifer Walsh died for 11 minutes during emergency surgery, and when she recovered, her husband noticed that their wedding photos showed different flowers than he remembered ordering. Their wedding album, which had been stored in a safety deposit box for 8 years, contained images that neither of them recalled taking. The photographs weren't altered or replaced. They were original prints with the correct dates and photographer's stamp, but they documented a wedding that seemed to combine elements from their actual ceremony with details from somewhere else entirely. The research revealed that the length and depth of the near-death experience correlated directly with the extent of reality discrepancies afterward. Patients who were clinically dead for less than 3 minutes rarely reported changes. Those dead for 3 to 7 minutes reported minor discrepancies, usually involving brand names, logos, or small historical details. But patients who experienced clinical death for more than 7 minutes, like Michael and Linda, reported comprehensive reality shifts affecting personal memories, geographical knowledge, and fundamental historical facts. Dr. Martinez's most unsettling discovery came from analyzing the timing of these reports. The frequency of post-NDE reality shifts had increased dramatically since 2012, with cases tripling between 2020 and 2024. Either the medical community had become more aware of the phenomenon, or the phenomenon itself was becoming more common. Given that resuscitation techniques and success rates had remained relatively stable during this period, the increase suggested that something about reality itself might be changing. The implications extended beyond individual cases. If consciousness could slip between realities during near-death experiences, it raised profound questions about the nature of death, identity, and existence. Were the millions of people who survived clinical death actually returned to their original lives, or had they been distributed across alternate realities? Was the increasing frequency of Mandela effect reports connected to the growing number of successful resuscitations in modern medicine? The research also suggested that reality might not be as stable as previously assumed. If multiple versions of reality existed simultaneously, and consciousness could access them under extreme circumstances, then the fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence needed to be reconsidered. The boundary between life and death might not be a wall but a permeable membrane, allowing consciousness to drift between possible worlds. As word of this research spread through both medical and scientific communities, a disturbing pattern emerged. Colleagues who learned about the reality shift phenomenon began recognizing it in their own NDE patients. Support groups formed quietly, bringing together survivors who shared impossible memories and unexplainable changes to their personal reality. The medical establishment remained officially skeptical, but privately, more and more professionals were documenting cases that challenged everything they thought they understood about consciousness and death. The question that haunted everyone involved in this research was whether they were discovering something new about human consciousness, or whether consciousness had always possessed this ability and they were only now becoming aware of it. If near-death experiences had been quietly redistributing people across parallel realities for centuries, it would explain countless historical mysteries, unexplained disappearances, and reports of impossible memories.
The evidence was mounting, the testimonies were multiplying, and the implications were becoming impossible to ignore. Something extraordinary was happening at the boundary between life and death, something that suggested consciousness was far more complex and reality far less stable than anyone had ever imagined. But perhaps the most disturbing realization was that if these findings were correct, then everyone who had ever been brought back from clinical death needed to ask themselves a simple question. Am I living the life I was supposed to live, or did I wake up in someone else's reality? The answer to that question might determine not just our understanding of near-death experiences, but our entire concept of what it means to be alive.